My name is Guillaume. I'm here with Olivier today. We're really pleased to discuss about that. This is meant to be an open conversation. So please, if you have questions, we'll try to keep some time to have a few questions back and forth before the half hour. So I'll go very fast and then we can ask many questions. So just a bit about L-Acoustics. L-Acoustics, we are a sound system manufacturers and we use spatial audio for live performances at large scale. This is where we come from. And more we're interested in spatial audio workflow from the creation to the performance and also to the delivery in consumer formats. We work with different artists. It could be shows here in London with ABBA Voyage. Maybe you've been to that show in East London, or artists in Vegas in residencies like Adele, Katy Perry, big tours like Billie Eilish, or festivals like the BBC Proms every summer with spatial audio as well. All right. So just a few reminders. We have two kinds of contents today. Contents where the speakers are hard-coded. In that case, I put stereo or 5.1, any bed, basically. And also we have content where the speakers is an independent notion, like ambisonics, which is a 3D encoding of a sound scene, or what we call audio objects. An audio object is basically an audio file and some metadata to describe some properties, such as its position in space. And what is very interesting today is that we see all these concepts being mixed together in today's workflow: stereo, 5.1, ambisonics, objects, which is a bit hard to follow. So this is a kind of very simplified, high-level overview of what we could have as a workflow. On the left, you have the live use case, and on the right, maybe the studio use case. If we look at different steps, maybe you want to create a piece or a song. If we look at the live side, we can start with maybe preparing a show. So usually there is a pre-production, you do a premix as a sound engineer, and then there is a few performances that you can maybe record and then post-produce. And at the end, always, there is the listener experience. And what we can say today is, on the live side, actually it's quite a controlled approach where we can control all the environment from the creation to the mixing to the sound system layout to how the audience will experience it. So it's a quite controlled environment, which is it's good for us. It's a good situation to be in. On the other side, if we look at the studio use case, I've put maybe an orange tag here, you see on the right. Actually, the ways to experience spatial audio today are very broad. It can be from headphones to multi-channel loudspeaker to stereo to transaural to anything ranging from your kitchen to your car. So it can be very, very broad in terms of listening conditions, which is a challenge as well for creating a compelling mix. If we go up the chain, what is interesting is that we see now in the industry a kind of standard file format that anyone can use to deliver spatial audio. It's called ADM, Audio Definition Model, and it's a file that contains all the stems and the metadata that you can use to encode into Atmos, MPEG-H, but these are proprietary formats, and what we see also coming are more open formats that will be available in different devices. For example, last week, Google and Samsung announced a new format called IAMF, which is interesting to follow. And in a few years' time, there's going to be a standard in every mobile phone on the planet that allows for scene-based, object-based, and bed delivery called 3GPP IVAS, and these two formats are open. If we go up the chain a bit more, what we can see here is that on the live side, we are in a good situation where there can be tools or fixed installation of multi-channel speaker configuration. There is a bunch of solutions on the market. L-Acoustics is one of them. There are also great solutions from DNB, Meyer Sound, Adamson, etc. And I think the mastering topic is still maybe an open discussion to be had in a post-production topic. I think on the mixing side, the industry has evolved a lot. Today, you can find a lot of native object panners and ambisonic spanner in DAWs. The major DAWs cover that topic now, which is great. I think there is still a big barrier to entry to do that, which is to have a proper spatial audio studio at home. It can be quite a challenge to have many loudspeakers around you. So I think that the topics of having headphone-based rendering are great solutions today. And I just wanted to point out as well, between the studio world and the live world, the speaker layouts can be very different. On the left side, I've put a quick diagram of a typical Dolby Atmos home setup, 714. What you see on the right side is a typical pre-production layout for live sound, which is a tiny bit different. So I think this is where we reach the biggest challenges so far. When we go to the edit stage, maybe we have created some great stems, we have created some great melodies and rhythms and beats, etc. We still edit most of the stuff we create in mono or stereo. I don't think most of the edits they're not done in the spatial domain yet. So this is still a topic where, as an industry, I think we could improve a lot of things. And you see, I've drawn a line between the edit stage and the other stage. This is where sometimes the assets are handed over to a different person to do the mix or to do the pre-production. So there is a transmission of creative ideas there where there is something to be done. Because how do you transmit spatial information between, the music producer and the mixing engineer, for example? There are no tools to do that properly today. And if we go to the create stage, I think it's even more an opportunity for the industry to imagine maybe spatial ways to create sound and to create stems. So there is a few initiatives. There are a few companies doing spatial synthesizer, for example, that are quite interesting to look at. But as a whole, most of the stems in the music industry, they are still mono or stereo. So there is an opportunity maybe to discuss and see what we could improve in terms of formats or things like that. So I'll hand over to Olivier to maybe explain a bit more.
Thanks, Guillaume. So, as Guillaume mentioned, at the moment there is a disconnection between the spatial information and the audio. And so I'm going to tell you about things you all already know, and then maybe ideally try to seed some ideas. Do we have any DAW maintainers here? Plugin formats maintainer? Great, okay. So these are ideas for you guys. So if we look at a DAW track, so I'm using the word track here. I know some DAWs think out of the box and don't have tracks. But I think you'll see what I get. So first we start with some audio. So either a live input that we're going to be recording, and once we've done our recording, we have a WAV file or whatever. Then we have an effects chain, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Effects can talk to the DAW to set and get parameter states. Effects can't talk between each other. Actually, that's quite important. After that, we've got our panner and fader, and then our routing and mixing. And it's important to not forget about MIDI, which can also be a source of data, which is then transformed into audio using MIDI instruments. So what's really interesting with this chain is those plugins, they can do anything they want to audio and MIDI. So you can have a plugin that discards the audio completely. That's what we call instruments. You could have effects, you could have utility plugins like EQ, compressors, mixing tools, creative tools, mastering tools, and they all fit pretty well into the plugin formats we have today. And it's the same for MIDI. So if we now look at how DAWs implement spatial audio today, and there have been great efforts that have been made over the past few years. So that's what they do. So you keep all of that because this we know it already works. We have legacy code bases, so we don't want to touch it too much. So we still have a fader. We don't have a traditional stereo panner because it doesn't make sense for spatial audio. And then we have this renderer block. So the renderer is the secret source that turns audio, like mono audio or maybe stereo audio information, and the positioning information, which comes from an object panner, to create our spatial audio field. So that could be binaural, 5.1, 7.1. In case of ELISA, it can be any speaker format. It doesn't need to be predefined. And then we still have the routing, and we still have the MIDI in the picture. And what we can see here is the... so I'm going to move this up. Forgot what my animations were doing. Yes. So as Guillaume mentioned, the audio and the spatial informations live in completely different place in the DAW. And the plugins also have currently no way to access or manipulate the spatial information, which is a shame because they can do this to the audio and they can do this to the MIDI, right? You could have a plugin which, so for example, in the talk before, we talked about machine learning on MIDI. You can have a machine learning plugin that would analyze some audio, generate some MIDI, and then transform it using some machine learning, produce some MIDI, and then have a VST instrument later on. And what's really great with this chain is what generates the MIDI is not necessarily the same product as the one then doing the audio synthesis from that MIDI. So you can really mix and match, and that's why we have a flourishing community of audio developers, is because this infrastructure that we have is super flexible. And so you can pick your favorite EQ, you can pick your favorite synth, you can pick whatever you want. And in the spatial audio at the moment, it's not possible. So as I said, audio and content and spatial behavior live in different places, which means panning is seen as a mixing tool rather than a way of expressing creativity. So again, we're talking about that disconnect. If you're a music producer and you're not mixing your own songs, so for example, we worked with a producer called Max Cooper, and he did recently a Dolby Atmos release of his album. For each track, he had a spatial brief, so literally writing on paper what he wanted that he gave to his mixing engineer, which is, really a shame because he has an idea and it would be good for him to have tools to express this spatial intent right from the start in his tool of choice, which in this case is Ableton Live. So let's make the panning part of the content. So what would be great is to have the object panner at the source of information, and then, hey, let's do like audio and MIDI. We can manipulate it. So we could have an effect, take some audio and maybe generate some spatial behaviors based on the audio. We could have a spatial synthesizer, which has some built-in spatial content based on the note you play. Any effects you can think of that can manipulate the audio and the spatial metadata any way we want, just like we do for audio and MIDI. I know it's a lot of work. And so the last thing is, at the moment, the two main players in the music production space are Dolby with Dolby Atmos and Sony with Sony 360. And the integrations in the DAWs have been done kind of in a proprietary way. So if you use Pro Tools, you have Dolby Atmos support. We have our own renderer. It's made for live. If we want our users to use Pro Tools and hear how it's going to sound using our renderer, at the moment, they can't do it easily. They can by outputting all the audio outside of the DAW, but then they need a separate piece of software running on the side, which is a bit clunky. And I think renderers, just like EQ plugins, will all have their strengths and weaknesses, and it would be really, really good to let users switch between renderers. So for example, I know at the moment, if you're mixing for Dolby Atmos and you're targeting Apple Music, you can mix with the Dolby tools. You will have the Dolby binaural renderer in Pro Tools, But Apple's renderer is different than the Dolby one, and it will sound different. If you use Logic, you'll have the Apple binaural renderer, but maybe you don't like Logic. Maybe you want to mix in Pro Tools. And at the moment, if you like Pro Tools, you don't have an easy way of... Sorry, maybe I'm saying something. We do now. Okay, sorry, I wasn't aware. But I guess it's not through an open plugin format that we could tap in either. Okay. Okay, cool. All right, so it's going in the right direction. That's good. Being able to do A/B comparisons between different renderers, etc., etc. So there's one more concept I'd like to touch upon because that's something we do internally at ELISA. That would be great. And that will be familiar for anyone doing mastering. It's the concept of bus effects, because with object-based mixing, this becomes a lot harder because that creation of this final bus that you listen to actually happens on device. So after the mixing and mastering stage, which has almost disappeared. So we have our 2 tracks. What we could do is let an effect tap into this audio, just like a bus effect would do, and then generate some new objects. So in ELISA, we have a 3D reverb, which is, let's say, a canvas, a space canvas for all our audio objects to sit in. And the only way of doing this is to have access to all the audio objects and the positioning metadata, and then we generate some more audio channels. So it'd be great to be able to do that. Then comes the question of when you're done with your mix and you want to publish it, you need to record. At the moment, if you're producing stereo, you can do an offline bounce. If your computer is fast, this is going to be much faster than real time. We can do that now with tight integrations of object-based formats in DAWs, and you will record an ADM file. At the moment, you record, well, I've put the arrow, so you record all the post-effects mono tracks or stereo tracks and the metadata, which means there is, as I said, there is no mastering. Maybe we would want to be able to record here, because if you record here, you record a pre-rendered bus, so you would have to pick on a bus configuration, so I don't know, 714, 712, 916, and then you can start doing some mastering. So the problem is it's a trade-off. You lose the object information, which gives you the most flexibility at rendering time, but you're able to do this bus processing, which at the moment has been lost with object-based audio. So that's what this block was for. How do we do mastering? I have no clue. Is there a way for content providers to specify in their mix a mastering chain that needs to be processed at runtime on device? I think we're far from that. But maybe one day. And that's basically where I'm going to stop. So thank you for listening. And now is the time for question and answers.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. That's really enlightening. Just before we jump to the questions, the person who said something earlier, I just wondered if you want to say that on the mic to get for anyone who's listening at home on streaming. Who was it he said? Who was talking about the open API? Someone did it? A few of us. Okay. Does someone want to just say something on the mic to explain clearly what was said, just for those who are listening at home?
Hello. The first thing is just to explain on the microphone that there are ways to, in real time, monitor the Apple spatialization inside of any DAW. There are third-party plugins that do it. Logic has it built in, and there are ways to route audio if you're using a Dante setup or any sort of inter-application audio. So that is absolutely possible in real time. And just a couple of things with the mastering. If you got 6 mastering guys in here or girls who do Atmos mastering, and they exist because they're about to get Grammys, they all do it in very, very different ways. And the processing across objects is definitely a thing. And there have been a couple of products trying to do it, but obviously you're sending metadata between plugins, and for dynamics processing, it has to be sample accurate. and it isn't. So that's a thing. That would be great. The only other thing I wanted to mention is that as a mixer, if I'm mixing in stereo and all of my sources are stereo, that's a nightmare. And the same is true for immersive mixing. I love having mono and stereo sources to then decide where they can go. And there are quite a few plugins that will take a mono or stereo thing and explode it into an immersive speaker format that then allows me to have some things that I'm treating as immersive objects, and then I still have mono and stereo to create a mix. And I've heard your systems live, and they're amazing. So anyway, that's it.
Okay, thank you. Is there anyone who's got any questions? I imagine there's a few. Yep.
Now that object-based mixing has become kind of more mainstream with Dolby and Sony and Apple pushing for this, I notice often people, when they're talking about this, are combining the concept of object-based mixing and the renderer as a delivery format. And I'm just kind of curious, any thoughts you have on that topic of object-based mixing as a paradigm on its own, potentially separate from delivery? Because you could do object-based mixing with 60-degree stereo pair as well.
Correct. I think it might be a question of archiving as well. What is the best format to retain the most information possible? So in a way, as soon as you start mixing in beds, you store what the bed is capable of, right? So if you do a 5.1 mix, you want to do a 916 mix 4 years after, maybe you want to come back to the original stems and redo the entire mix. So I think one of the great things about ADM, for example, this new format, if you do a full object-based mix, you could always decide to render in whatever bed format you want afterwards, which is a bit the beauty of the object, in a way. You can decide later, because the pure goal of the object-based chain is you decide at the last stage possible. So that's one of the benefits, but it's also more complex today.
Any more questions?
So one question to this new format is this, as you said, that the BAT is not based on a certain amount of channels. So is it more a format like ambisonics, or is it still something that is more like spatial audio?
So if you open an ADM file, I think there are many DAWs now where you can export your spatial mix as ADM. If you look at it, it's really it's an XML description of the different audio files you have. And each of them is basically, I'm a mono object or a stereo object. I've got this position. This is how my movement is described in time. So it's, a few chunks of metadata that you can find and follow with the timeline. So it looks like automation, really. But you can decide to apply it for 2 speakers, 5 speakers, or more whenever you want. So you can configure your speaker layout separately from where the objects are positioned in space. There are 2 different things. I don't know whether that answers your question. Yeah? Okay.
Hi, thank you for your talk. A lot of the spatial panning tools that I see are all kind of assuming a speaker layout where all of the speakers are spaced equally. And the sort of work that I do, I'm more based in installation work, where we have very bespoke speaker setups for each different project. And I was wondering if you knew of any tools which are good for defining weird speaker setups and being able to pan sounds around them. Brilliant.
Lol. No, more seriously, I think there is many tools on the market, and there is always a good tool for your need. I think it mostly depends on what is the algorithm behind the tool, because for your specific use case, maybe you're looking at more distance-based panning than the basic VBAP or amplitude panning. Maybe there is something where you need a real 3D world description. So there are tools that can do different algorithm rendering. This is why I think it's interesting to have the notion of being able to swap renderers in a DAW, because maybe at some point you have the same assets and you do an Atmos mix for a streaming platform, but maybe you want to reuse that for a site installation, and in that case you would need a different renderer. So this is where I think the ecosystem could be very open in the future.
Okay, any more in-house questions? Yep.
Thank you. For the problem with the sharing of spatial metadata between different plugins, can you use OSC to send that spatial messages to basically just bypass it all completely?
So that's what we do at the moment because our renderer lives outside of the DAW. And I believe that's how the Dolby renderer worked also for a while. And so if you want to have the panning metadata in the DAW to have it in your timeline, then you need to get it out of the plugin to either another plugin or something else. OSC is a way of doing it. That's how we're doing it. The problem is then you get into all sorts of problems with latency compensation, network jitter. And then if you want to do that faster than real-time render bounce, you can't really do it anymore because it works in real time when you're assuming your DAW is going to process all your tracks, in parallel real time. If you're trying to render, if for an offline render, the DAW were to render one track as fast as possible and then the next track as fast as possible, then this kind of approach completely breaks, which is one of the reasons we haven't really pursued to go further in these kinds of integrations, because we felt that it was maybe a bit too clunky and a bit too limited.
Okay, thanks.
Going off that train of thought, and also with what you said about sample accuracy, I'm not that versed in the sound object mixing and mastering, but if the metadata is just, again, floating point numbers, maybe 3 different to do 3 space, couldn't plugins just use 3 more tracks to simply pass it? And then there's no need for almost anything to be done to the plugin standards. You just have more buffers, and it's just a matter of designing the GUIs around them to make sure that, I generate these 3, and then other plugins knowing I'm supposed to leave these 3 alone. It seems like that would solve all the problems with the latency and the jitter with OSC, and would be the least amount of work for plugin developers and manufacturers.
I would say that's a very developer approach. I thought about hacking MIDI to do it.
Yeah, then you lose, the sample accuracy, if that's what's important, that gets you audio rate modulation.
But I think it's too complex to explain to end users. Like at the moment, one of our goals is to get music makers, creators to think about the spatial intent of their creation.
Right.
As we said, at the moment, the spatial intent is mostly left to the mixing engineer. And so we want tools that they can use very easily. And here we're talking about like multi-channel audio routing between plugins, or even if it's in the same chain, like...
Sure, but you could have a pan pot that writes to an audio buffer. There's no reason to change the interface because of the underlying communication method's a buffer. That's kind of the suggestion. So it wouldn't necessarily reflect as a more complex interface to a user. That's just the thought.
It would work as long as we all agree. So that's something we haven't touched on, actually. Cartesian versus spherical representations.
Sure. Yeah.
Being able to pan in the box, as we say, or only on the outside surface. If we want a flourishing ecosystem of plugins from different companies that are interoperable, there's a lot of work ahead.
Thanks for the talk. In terms of interaction with the system, obviously with a spatial audio system that's object-based, you've got so many more parameters when it comes to spatializing objects compared to a stereo mix. Do you envisage any further changes in the way that users and mixing engineers interact with that system, versus just a regular pan pot?
Yes, so that's exactly... when we talk to creators, they tell us, I don't have time to do a spatial mix because it's too much work. At the moment, it's mostly automation-based. I believe some panning plugins have step sequencers in them to help you automate some movements. In ELISA, we have some what we call motion effects, which are parametric ways of creating movements.
I think there are ways where the movement can come from the audio as well. So it could be, there are some companies doing energy-based spatialization plugins that are quite interesting. It could be related to any input data, really. So it could be linked to maybe some cool MPE parameters from a synth, or the amount of voices you play at the same time. I don't know. I mean, the sky is the limit there. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, let's give a warm welcome again. Applause to the visitors.